My name is Ann Peterman. I want to welcome everybody to our virtual press conference on the petition to deregulate the Darling 58 or D58 genetically engineered American chestnut tree. My name is Ann Peterman. I'm the Executive Director of Global Justice Ecology Project, and I coordinate the international campaign to stop GE trees. Yesterday, the USDA public comment period closed, which accepted people's comments for the petition requesting deregulation of the genetically engineered or GE Darling 58 or D58 American chestnut tree. If approved, the D58 would be the first ever GE forest tree approved for unregulated release in the US. It also sets dangerous precedents as the first fertile GMO plant designed to spread wildly without monitoring to contaminate wild relatives with its engineered trait. But we also wanted to highlight opposition to this and all GE trees. Genetically engineered trees have been actively opposed for more than 20 years. To date, Brazil and China are the only two countries to have approved GE trees, and China is the only country with GE tree plantations. The opposition shown against the genetically engineered D58 tree and the unprecedented proposal to release it into forests has been historic. The only GE tree that has come up for regulatory approval in North America prior to this was a genetically engineered eucalyptus manufactured by GE tree company Arborgen for use in plantations. More than 40,000 individuals lodged opposition to that GE tree during its public comment period on the Arborgen petition. Today, however, at the close of the public comment period on the petition to deregulate the genetically engineered D58, 109 organizations representing millions of members have joined the effort to stop its approval. More than 123,000 individuals have registered opposition, and more than 400 organizations have endorsed a full global ban on the release of this and all GE trees into the environment. So today, we are going to hear from representatives of 4 of the organizations that have endorsed this effort, who are going to discuss why the deregulation of the Darling 58 or D58 GE tree must be rejected. The speakers we will hear from today include Dana Pearls, Food and Technology Program Manager at Friends of the Earth, BJ McManama, Save Our Roots campaign organizer with Indigenous Environmental Network, Scott Coranda, Communications Director with the Dogwood Alliance, and Lucy Sherritt, Coordinator with the Canadian Biotechnology Action Network. Following the presentations, we will accept questions. You can submit them ahead of time via the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. But I would like to first introduce our first speaker, who is Dana Pearls. Dana Pearls is the Food and Technology Program Manager at Friends of the Earth and leads the Food and Agriculture team's international and national regulatory and market campaigns on biotechnology and genetic engineering. She combines this work with her commitment to environmental justice. She's going to give us an overview of the issues around genetic engineering and some of the history of the opposition since the technology was first introduced. Go ahead, Dana.
Thank you so much. I want to really emphasize that right now we stand at a crossroads with 2 starkly different and very fundamentally incompatible visions for the future of ecosystems, one which leads us to resiliency and regeneration and justice for communities, biodiversity, and the climate, and the other, which is one of genetic engineering, leads us to ecosystems and processes that entrench the current health, social, economic inequities and worsening the climate and biodiversity crises. History has really taught us the serious need for precaution with genetic engineering experiments like the Darling 58. And we should really not be playing God in the garden with things that scientists don't understand. And we've seen this trend over and over again with genetically engineered crops and now with new genetic engineering applications. You know, we've seen 30 years of GMO crops such as corn and soy and cotton, and they've led to massive increases in toxic herbicides like glyphosate, a probable carcinogen. And we've also seen an increased corporate consolidation and massive biodiversity collapses like the insect die-offs and the decrease in bird populations. And in response, within the food system, people across the US are continuing to reject GMOs in their food. And actually, the non-GMO market remains one of the fastest growing food trends in the United States. The D58 GE chestnut tree will follow the path of this destructive and failed genetically engineered crop system, including GE monocultures that wipe out biodiversity, harm the soil, climate, and human health, and further concentrate power amongst a small handful of corporations that are now seeking to engineer wild ecosystems amid a global ecosystem collapse. So this Darling 58 really falls into the trend of what we've seen historically. And these GE trees are not an isolated application. They're part of a bigger wave of genetic engineering that we're seeing right now. Companies are trying to profit from the redesign of nature with products ranging from gene-edited CRISPR herbicide-tolerant seeds, genetically engineered insects like the mosquitoes designed as new biopesticides, genetically engineered animals like the GE salmon, and gene silencing pesticides like RNAi spray. And specifically, I want to highlight the genetically engineered mosquito as a parallel warning of the unintended consequences and the very permanent damage that could happen from the contamination into wild species. Oxitec is the GE mosquito biotech company that designed the GE mosquito with the intention of reducing mosquito populations, but the technology doesn't work. And instead, the spread of GE mosquitoes into wild species could create vastly more problems like increased virus transmission, the spread of more diseases, and resistance to insecticides. And so this contamination may create far more problems than anything else. What's more, community members are not being given the right to the free and prior informed consent ahead of a very risky and virtually unassessed experiment. And essentially, community members will be human experiments against their will. And I would argue that decisions about how to solve public health problems must include the communities affected, not outside corporations and institutions. More broadly, the genetic changes to a population may persist for a very long time, possibly permanently, and that's a similarity between the GE mosquito experiment and the D58 experiment. And this may result in far-reaching and unpredictable consequences for society and the environment. At a time when species are disappearing at an accelerated rate, we really need to be focused on the most ecological, safe, and effective approaches. We need to be looking at community-driven projects which have proven to be successful, rather than genetic engineering experiments which may put communities, public health, and forest ecosystems at risk, which is indeed what we've consistently seen over the past 30 years and continue to see now with the new applications. Thank you.
Thank you, Dana. I want to turn the mic over now to BJ McManama. BJ represents the Indigenous Environmental Network and has been involved with Indigenous and environmental issues for over 28 years. And she participates with local organizations whose focuses include maintaining food security and safety and protecting water resources and forests from encroaching extractive industries. BJ is also a member of the Campaign to Stop GE Trees Steering Committee and works closely with both Indigenous and frontline community organizations on forest protection, climate justice, and subsistence rights. BJ is going to be talking a little bit about Indigenous traditional knowledge and the broader implications of the D58 on Indigenous self-determination. Thank you, BJ.
Thank you, Anne, and good afternoon, everyone. And as a representative of the Indigenous Environmental Network, the Indigenous elders and community people who we've consulted with have expressed concern that this and each successive step taken toward genetically altering the building blocks of life by unnaturally combining DNA from totally unrelated organisms is not the way to right the wrongs that to date humans have caused. They are opposed to genetic engineering plants, animals, and naturally occurring organisms that are not found in nature, and in so doing is dangerous at best and catastrophic in the long run. Every step taken in this direction has the potential to further threaten the Earth's delicate biodiversity that continues to be weakened by unchecked natural resource exploitation and a radically changing climate. The formal request for deregulation will allow the release of genetically engineered elements into wild environments, which is a direct violation of the rights of nature. Humans did not create the web of life, nor do humans have the knowledge, wisdom, or moral imperative to continue down this path by attempting, in this case, to alter the biological makeup of forest ecosystems. There is a deep complexity to how every organism, plant, and animal contributes to these unique systems, of which humans know little to nothing about the world. Nothing in this world lives in isolation, and the creators of this new tree variant with foreign DNA unnaturally added to its original genetic makeup are proposing to use our forests in an experiment with varying degrees of uncertainty as to the outcomes. We also risk unleashing countless new and potentially catastrophic interactions with virtually unknown results. As Indigenous peoples, we are bound by our knowledge to revere, celebrate, and respect this complexity as sacred. Humans are just one part of this web, but also inherently know if we exploit the elements of biodiversity that we depend on to survive, it is within our power to destroy it. And as such, we destroy ourselves. Human knowledge is currently limited to the bits and pieces of biological interactions, and there is overwhelming evidence shown in the results of what can happen in controlled agricultural systems from actions based on little more than assumptions, how pests and pathogens and plants are able to evolve in their own defense and overcome human efforts to eradicate or alter life forms to serve purely human desires. The USDA APHIS's decision will impact Indigenous peoples in regard to cultural, spiritual, and self-determination of their territories. Today, there remain large areas of traditional and treaty lands on which much is forested and managed as sovereign territory of many different Native peoples. These forests are not only a source of economic self-determination, but hold great cultural significance to include sacred sites where the trees are an element of sustenance, knowledge, and family identity. Every living being within the forest are related in some form, and nothing in these lands lives in isolation. Therefore, changing or altering the original instructions of any one or any part of these elements threatens the natural order established over millennia. We also state for the record that we, IN, oppose genetic engineering of all living organisms for the purpose of opposing the deregulation of the GE Darling 58 chestnut variant specifically, and additionally genetic engineering forest trees on Turtle Island and the whole of Mother Earth. However, we do not speak for all Indigenous peoples, and why a decision based on this request precipitates the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, free, prior, and informed consent in the form of fully consulting with Native American tribal members in order for them to exercise their rights as sovereigns within the United States and Canada. I want to thank you for your time and consideration of our position, and I hope you and your loved ones are and remain well.
Thanks very much, BJ. We're going to move right along, so we don't want to take up people's time. So we're going to next hear from Scott Coranda. Scott has been with the Dogwood Alliance since 2000. He is their communications director, but he has also served as a campaign organizer, field director, and a campaign director, and is currently in charge of storytelling, creative media relations, and public relations. He will be addressing the impacts of the D58 GE tree on southern US communities and forests, and how the approval of the D58 would open the door to other commercial GE trees and GE tree plantations. Thank you, Scott.
Thank you very much. As noted, my name is Scott Carano, the Communications Director at Dogwood Alliance. We are an organization that advances environmental justice and climate action by mobilizing communities to protect southern forests from industrial logging, and really appreciate you all attending today. The southern US is global ground zero for the forest products industry, and we see genetically engineered chestnut trees as the industry's sneaky way of opening the floodgates for Franken trees that will harm forests, biodiversity, and local communities across our region. Our natural forests that support wildlife and the economic sovereignty of rural communities will rapidly be replaced with tree plantations for wood pellets, paper, and more, leaving environmental and climate injustice in its wake. Our region has a long history of forest destruction and meddling from the biotech industry that is interested in turning our forests into genetically engineered monsters. That is why we were one of the original founders of the Stop GE Trees Coalition. Through the years, we have seen attempts by industry to engineer loblolly pines, for example, for faster growth, herbicide tolerance, and even things as crazy as having less lignin, which would produce fragile trees that could impact natural forests. We were also the test region, as Anne noted in her opening, for the genetically modified eucalyptus, which would not naturally grow here because it's not hot enough. And there was an attempt to engineer that tree to be cold tolerant so that more of our forest could become monoculture plantations. Genetically engineered trees have the potential to harm biodiversity, the plants and animals that rely on intact natural forests. They also can lead to a higher use of chemical pesticides and herbicides, and the potential for genetic drift with any of these Franken trees could wreak havoc on the web of life. The genetically engineered chestnut, cutely named the Darling 58, is what I would call a wolf in sheep's clothing. By starting with a tree that has such a history and heritage in our region, it would allow the normalization of genetic engineering and open the floodgates to more dangerous trees. This madness really needs to stop. There are two important reasons why these are false and dangerous solutions that are involved with this, which are the false and dangerous solutions of bioenergy and the economic independence and livelihood of rural communities of color that will be impacted. Our region has grown to become the world's largest exporter of wood pellets that are shipped overseas to Europe, South Korea, and Japan to be burned for electricity. Biomass energy is a mess. It's a false solution to climate change. And in fact, burning wood to produce electricity releases more carbon dioxide than coal for the equivalent amount of energy. Biotech wants to increase the amount of tree plantations on the landscape to feed this damaging market. And second, as noted, we are the world's largest producer of forest products. And the folks that are left behind in this region are the ones that see the most damaging impacts are poor rural communities, often communities of color, who can no longer rely on their forests for alternative economic solutions or personal livelihood. Instead, large landowners and corporations lock up the forests and turn them into crops, leaving stranded assets, air, water, and noise pollution, and decimated forests. We need to stop the further commodification of our forests and instead invest in local communities to help them find true environmental and economic solutions that support their growth and development rather than deplete all of their resources. Thank you very much for your time, and I'll be available at questions at the end.
Thanks so much, Scott. We're going to wrap up the formal presentations with Lucy Sherritt. Lucy Sherritt coordinates the Canadian Biotechnology Action Network. She works in Halifax, and CBAN brings together 16 groups to research, monitor, and raise awareness about issues related to genetic engineering in food and farming. She previously worked for the Sierra Club of Canada and the Polaris Institute. She also coordinated the international Ban Terminator campaign, which secured a strengthened global moratorium on genetically engineered sterile seed technology. She sits on the steering committee of the campaign to stop genetically engineered trees. Lucy will discuss the risk of contamination from the GED58 chestnut into Canada from a US release of this tree, and especially given the lack of monitoring. Thank you, Lucy.
Thank you, Anne. Yes, the Canadian Biotechnology Action Network is a pan-Canadian network that includes farmer associations, environmental and social justice groups, and regional coalitions of grassroots groups. And we are very concerned that the petition to deregulate not be accepted because of this threat of contamination from US plantings into Canada. The range of the American chestnut reaches into Canada to the southern part of one of our provinces. And it is expected that by the end of this century, the range of the American chestnut will expand into many provinces in Canada. And the current status of the Darling 58 in Canada is that this genetically engineered American chestnut tree is illegal. It is expected, or certainly the petitioners have said that they would like to ask for release in Canada. To our knowledge, there is no submission yet. This tree is not approved for use in Canada, and we cannot assume that if there is a submission to Canadian authorities, that in fact Canadian regulators will approve it. Additionally, the American chestnut is listed as an endangered species in Canada. It has protection as an endangered species, and we would argue that this protection needs to extend to protection from contamination from this genetically engineered tree. In the petition presented to the United States Department of Agriculture, there's no apparent strategy to contain the Darling 58 to the US range of the American chestnut. The current plan for dispersal of the tree relies on public distribution and planting, and we can see very clearly that tracking and monitoring, such as it is, will fall apart over time with implications for Canada. And in fact, ultimately, that this project in the United States, if allowed to move forward, would put the wild American chestnut in Canada at risk from contamination, counter to the project's goals of restoration. In Canada, the priority is to protect the remaining potential of wild American chestnut. We do share this American chestnut range, and we want to secure that future in Canada for the wild American chestnut. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Lucy. So we have time for some Q&A, some questions and answers. So we will open it up to anyone who would like to ask any more details or anything that was not covered by our panelists. Please feel free to do so.
Okay, this is Steve Taylor here. I'm with Communications. We, at this point, have several questions in the queue. So we're still taking questions, so feel free to offer them. But we have a question in the queue. The question is, genetic modification has happened historically with hybridization. What is wrong with adding a gene if we can bring back a species?
And I will open that up. Lucy or Dana, would you like to field that question?
Well, it's very clear actually that genetic modification is genetic engineering, which is this suite of new techniques. We haven't been able to move genetic material around between species or kingdoms until this point. The techniques are new and present a whole suite of new risks. And it is an assumption to say also that we can use this technology or these techniques to bring back a species when in fact we're genetically engineering that species in the lab. We're presenting a new genetically engineered organism to an ecosystem. So the very defining characteristics of genetic engineering include inherent risks that are new, but also the creation of a new gene sequence that has the potential to disrupt the genome in other ways. This is a laboratory creation. The idea of bringing back a species by creating a new organism, I would argue, is a dissonance. There's a conflict there conceptually and in reality.
Thank you. Dana, did you want to add anything?
I would just, go ahead, BJ.
I would just say that calling hybridization genetic engineering is wrong to begin with. Hybridization and the improvement, if you will, of our plants is done with the relatives of these other plants. You take what's happening right now with the American chestnut tree in the backcross program. They're taking Japanese and Chinese chestnuts and they're breeding them with the American chestnut because there is resistance in the Japanese and the Chinese versions. So, and there's great success taking place in this area. So to call what has been done for thousands of years with indigenous folks genetic engineering is just wrong, and it really does confuse people. So, and as far as CRISPR, moving genes, taking out different elements of the chromosome, we have no idea what the order of these chromosomes, what the individual chromosomes actually have in regard to the original instructions of how this plant or animal grows naturally. So if we're taking something out or moving it around, we have no idea what order of growth or maturity is going to happen. So, you know, this is what I've been told, this is what I report, and actually, I don't think it's real disputable. So, check, thank you.
And just to add that the data really supports what Lucy and BJ are saying. There's a growing amount of scientific data which shows what scientists and researchers are calling genetic havoc as a result of gene editing in plants, CRISPR crops, as well as gene edited animals and insects. That actually the only reliable result of these gene edited new genetic engineering technologies is unintended consequences for on target and off target traits, meaning that is indeed the only thing we can rely on, is that there will be surprise mutations and off target impacts that were not originally intended. And the scientific research is very clearly supporting that.
Fantastic. Do we have other questions? We also are a little bit over time, so I hope people who are on this webinar can stay around for a few more minutes. If you have to go, please feel free. We will be taping this and distributing the link later, so you can go back and visit it. But we will take just a couple of more questions to let the people have some input on the discussion. Go ahead, Steve.
What is wrong with commercial tree plantations if they help produce renewable resources?
Plantations are one of the worst things that humans have come up with, as far as I'm concerned. But essentially, plantations are really something done by industry to really push whatever product they're trying to push. What we're seeing with plantations, at least in our region, is that historically about 75% of the tree plantations that exist in the southern US, which has the largest amount of tree plantations in the world besides maybe China, and the numbers are a little off there in China, is that they're coming at the expense of natural forest. So 75% of the plantations that have been created in the last 20 years have replaced natural forests. So it's not just trees growing on fallow agricultural fields or some sort of regeneration. It's essentially the commodification of the landscape. And industry will call a plantation and trees a renewable resource. They'll call it sustainable, but all it is renewable and sustainable for their profit. It's not a benefit to our environment or the landscape. And I have a colleague in Mississippi, Kathy Egland, who is on the national board of the NAACP and works on environmental justice issues in Gulfport, Mississippi. She actually compares the tree plantations, that she calls them the new slave plantations, because when you look at a map of where many of the tree plantations are these days, you can overlay it with the old historical maps of where cotton plantations were. So we've replaced one historically damaging crop with another crop, simply for the production of things that we do not need. We should not be burning our forests for electricity. We should not be creating more paper when we could be doing more recycling. And as noted earlier, these plantations are a desert of biodiversity. There literally is no biodiversity. Famous biologist by the name of E.O. Wilson said that a tree plantation is 95 to 99% less diverse than a natural forest. So a tree plantation is not a forest. It is devoid of wildlife. It has one simple purpose, which is to increase the profit of corporations that are benefiting from it. And we've seen also around the world that tree plantations are a scourge. You look at a place like Indonesia that had some of the most beautiful rainforests in the world. Many of those rainforests have been leveled. Many peatlands have been leveled to put in eucalyptus plantations and palm oil plantations, which are wreaking havoc on our climate. These are some of the most important lands on the globe for storing and sequestering carbon. And instead, we're creating more tree plantations for products that we don't need and for false solutions to climate change. So tree plantations are an absolute disaster. We need to instead invest in protecting and restoring our natural forests for their climate benefits and for the economic sovereignty of the local communities, or in cases around the world of the indigenous communities that rely on those forests for their livelihood.
Thanks, Scott. I think unless we have a question from anyone else on the participants, we will give a closing remarks and let everyone be on their way. Okay. All right. Thank you very much to the panelists. This has been a very rich and wide conversation on this issue, which I think is very important. It tends to get very narrowly discussed as this magnificent tree that needs to be restored. And this is genetic engineering is the only way to do it. And as people have heard from our panelists, that is very much not the case. There are many angles to this issue, from social justice to biodiversity impacts, to water impacts, to et cetera, and even global impacts from this plantation issue that Scott's been mentioning. If the door is opened here in the United States to this first GE tree, this will give the green light for many other GE trees in the United States, which could potentially wind up in plantations all over the world. So this is very much an issue that will impact not only forests in the eastern United States, but communities in the eastern United States and all over the world. So that's a point that people need to keep in mind. This isn't just about putting a tree back in eastern forests. This is about, well, first of all, it's not even about that. It's about putting a genetically engineered facsimile of a tree that once existed in the eastern forest into the eastern forest. But it's also about creating a precedent that spreads genetically engineered trees all over the planet. I also wanted just to correct one other misnomer that comes out of the proponents for this chestnut, which is that it's only about forest restoration. And in fact, this genetically engineered tree is also about commercialization. People want to commercialize the genetically engineered American chestnut tree. And that is something to keep in mind as well. People want it for timber, they want it for biomass. Duke Energy has put a huge amount of money into the genetically engineered American chestnut tree, specifically for biomass and timber. And there have been other comments from researchers at the University of Georgia about that as well. So it's not just about restoration, it's also about commercialization. And that is something to keep in mind as well. And just to close, I want to point out that this is not the end of the effort around the Darling 58 genetically engineered tree. It is only the beginning. The publishing of the petition from the researchers requesting deregulation of this GE tree is the first step in the process of the USDA's process of whether or not to approve this tree. The next step will likely be something like an environmental impact statement, which will go up for more public comment. Then there will be some kind of a decision, which will be opened again for more public comment. So there's quite a bit of opportunity for people to get involved still. And we will be putting this up online. If people want to get involved, they can go to stopgetrees.org, and there are toolkits there, ways to sign up. And so please keep involved. If you want more information, please do. And if anyone wants to interview any of our panelists for a deeper conversation about this issue, that is available as well. And Steve, how should people get a hold of you about that?
Always contact me at steve@globaljusticeecology.org. So that's steve@globaljusticeecology.org. And we are going to be putting up a slide with people's contact information.
Thank you very much. I appreciate people taking time out of their busy day to listen to what we have to talk about with this very important precedent-setting issue. And we look forward to speaking with you more. And anyone who is interested in becoming involved, please contact us through stopgetrees.org.